Hi folks, my name is Ravi, and in this video I want to talk about integration testing, right? So this is not related to any specific platform, like I'm not talking anything specific to .NET or Java, but in general, when you build web applications, how important are integration tests? I think a lot of times we tend to skip over integration tests. We are in this phase of churning out new features constantly to create business value to the end users and the stakeholders. But in the process, a lot of times the integration tests um, tend to be on the back burner. I think it's a really it's a bad practice to do that. The reason I say that is because you'll have a lot of confidence in your application if you also add integration tests right from the get-go. Right? They don't have to be, even if they're a sprint behind. Once the use case is stable, I think it's really important to just create an integration test. So in this particular uh, recording, I want to talk about what should you integration test, right? You already have unit tests that test a lot of different scenarios. If you take a given use case, the happy path, all the edge cases, the negative scenarios, all of these get tested in the unit tests, um, and all the dependencies get isolated, or I'm sorry, get mocked in the unit tests, so that you can focus on that unit of functionality, and that's the scope of the unit test, right? You take each component in your architecture and you unit test each of those functions in isolation, mocking all the dependencies, so that you make sure that particular set of functionality is working as expected when you put it under test with various scenarios. So that's what unit testing does. On the flip side, the integration tests, you don't need to cover as extensively as you do for unit tests. You could just do the happy paths, and that's fine in my experience. And this is a very subjective topic. Different people may have different opinions, but based on my past experience, integration tests will give you a lot of confidence that your system is working as per the expectations. Especially useful once you're in the implementation phase, and if you want to roll off your product to operations, um, or maintenance to support, then the integration tests give a lot of confidence for your application. Like, hey, the application is working fine as long as the integration tests are all passing. So that said, we talked about one main point, which is integration tests can test just the happy paths, right? If you have 500 unit tests, you may not need 500 integration tests. If the happy paths are only 50, 50 integration tests are just fine. Now, also, within those 50 integration tests, what are we actually testing? Are we testing end-to-end, complete end-to-end? Or is there an option to like swap out certain components that we feel are very volatile? Um, so does that help? Is that even a pattern that we should consider? My my belief is that yes, absolutely. Integration test does not have to be end-to-end, right? There's nowhere it's written that, hey, integration test means you have to integrate every single damn thing in your project. Nope. Mainly, there are a couple of things. In your project, there are certain components that are high voltage components, right? Some are very risky. They're changeable. There's a lot of business logic embedded in it. Uh, so those are the components you definitely want to make sure you write an integration test, how they're connecting to their surrounding components, right? So in my opinion, you can test any subset of the components, right? It doesn't have to be a complete end-to-end. For example, let's say your whole project is divided into, let's say, 4 different layers or components. You can test any 2 components together if you want. or 3 or 4 or all of them. It all depends on the vision for your integration test. You want to test everything? Fine. But sometimes the reason why I say a subset is also fine is because sometimes, let's say that you have your app depends on a third-party API, and that API is not always guaranteed to be up in a lower environment where you're testing. For example, integration tests are not running in production, right? Because just usually as part of the integration test, you should be staging data and unstaging data so that you're not relying on existing stale data. So obviously we don't want to insert test data in production for various reasons that I'm not going to talk about. So you tend to do the integration testing in a lower landscape. So that lower landscape also depends on this third-party API, but there is no guarantee that the data that you can read or write to that API is consistent from day to day. Today it may work, tomorrow it may not work. It depends on, because you don't own that API, somebody else does, or even if it's in the same organization and it may be another team, and or it could be completely outside your organization, in which case it's even more volatile. So you can identify layers like that that are changeable, that are highly mutable, and you could swap those out with your own mock implementations so that you have your integration test will continue to run, and that helps with the confidence of your app. So you will be testing every layer with the assumption that the third party is working, right? So that's also possible. I've seen also many use cases where they even swap out the main database. Imagine that you're using a relational database. And for integration tests, you can use a relational in-memory database with your own configuration fed to it. So all of these techniques are possible, right? So anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Basically, two things. Number one is how much integration tests are required. Like I said, happy paths are just fine. Number two, what should you integration test? It could be end-to-end, or it could be a subset of the components, right? You can test any two components or more components, and that can be part of your integration test. You identify the volatile components, make sure you put an integration test for them, right? And especially when the product is going to be handed off to an operations team or something like that, you can do that with a lot of confidence, because as long as your tests are successfully passing, you're good to go. All right, thank you for listening.